That is a long walk, and I must say it's a very, very tough thing to follow, not just a Super Bowl champion, but a Super Bowl champion with the New York Giants. So it's an honor to be following OJ. And Roy White had 160 home runs. And you know, I've written a couple of books, well, one with Mookie Wilson, and I just finished another one. I traveled over 40,000 miles around the country to meet with the 86 Mets. And a lot of those Mets from the 86 team, they've had challenges in their lives, and they've worked to overcome them. But it was truly one of the greatest teams of all time and one of the most celebrated teams. But when I grew up, my father was a Yankee fan. So even though I started watching baseball in '73 when the Mets made the World Series against the A's, my dad was a huge Yankee fan. And so Roy White, getting a chance to meet him, was just such a thrill this evening. You know, Roy White hit 160 career home runs, played 15 years, so that's about 11 home runs a year. I swear every 160 of those home runs either tied a game or won the game for the Yankees. He was maybe the most incredible clutch hitter that the Yankees have ever had, truly. Roy White was as much a clutch hitter as Reggie, as much a clutch hitter as Nettles in the field as well. Roy White meant so much to those Yankee teams of the late '70s. So just an honor to attempt to follow these two New York icons, for sure. With baseball, I think former baseball commissioner A. Bartlett Giamatti said it best. He said, "It's designed to break your heart. It begins in the spring when everything begins again, and blossoms in the summer, filling our afternoons and evenings. But then when the chill rain comes, it stops, leaving us to face the fall alone." Well, thankfully, the New York Mets aren't leaving us just yet. This is a Yankee crowd, isn't it? Well, before I talk about the three books that I wrote, I just have to say that because they deal with overcoming adversity and stories that transcend baseball, a perfect segue into talking about some of the books I've written with some of the famous baseball players that I've written the books about is that this is the Pastime Club's 100th anniversary, and the 100th anniversary theme is progress in sports, which made it perfect for me because I haven't written books about Derek Jeter or Mariano Rivera. I mean, these guys, I'm sure that they have, issues with their families like we all do, but really, like a Derek Jeter, for 20 years, he was the superstar of New York. He was the prince of the city. I like to write books about guys that have had to deal with an awful lot in their lives and have had to overcome them. And with Progress in Sports, the first book that I wrote was with a gentleman named Glenn Burke. And my books are up here. And this is actually a baseball bat that Glenn Burke gave me. I was interviewing him 20 years ago. Sadly, he was on his deathbed dying of AIDS. Glenn Burke was the first Major League Baseball player to reveal that he was gay. And once he did, he was blackballed from the game of baseball. This was back in the late '70s. This bat that he gave me, he never lived to see the book published. A movie is now being made by the actress Jamie Lee Curtis of his life story. But he gave me this bat, and it means so much to me because he said that he used it in the '77 World Series against your Yankees, Roy. And it was the only possession that he had because after his playing days were over, he ended up on the streets of San Francisco, was homeless for a while, ended up in prison, and contracted AIDS. So progress in sports for Glenn Burke, today the sport is much more accepting. If you can play the game of baseball, no matter who you are, and baseball has always been a trendsetter. going back to 47 with Jackie Robinson. If you can play the game of baseball today, it's different than it was 30 years ago when Glenn Burke played. It's different than it was 60 years ago when Jackie Robinson was first starting out. So the theme tonight, progress in sports, really hits home to me. So that's the book I did with Glenn. Next book I did was with a guy named Steve Blass, who Roy White may have faced in spring training because he played in the National League for the Pittsburgh Pirates. Imagine being Jacob deGrom. It's a good example. Steve Blass was every bit as good as Jacob deGrom in '71 in the World Series when he beat a great Baltimore Orioles team twice. He gave up 1 run in each game. The Orioles had won 15 straight games until they faced Steve Blass. Blass beat him in Game 3 and beat him again in Game 7. Then he made the All-Star team the next year. On top of his game, at 30 years old, and the next year, he couldn't throw the ball straight. They call it Steve Blass disease. So, since I know that there are a lot of Yankee fans here, remember Chuck Knobloch. And there have been others where guys, it's the inexplicable ability to throw the ball straight anymore. That's what happened to Steve. Steve Blass went from pitching in the '71 World Series to 3 years later selling class rings so he could put food on his family's table. I mean, just a stunning fall from grace. But he reinvented himself. And this is the beauty of competitiveness and the spirit of it. So for the last 32 years, Steve Blass may very well be on his way to the Baseball Hall of Fame as a broadcaster with the Pittsburgh Pirates. And he's also one of the funniest people you'd ever want to meet. And the book that I wrote with him almost reads like a comedy book. It's great. And then there was the New York Times bestseller I did with Mookie Wilson. Now, Yankee fans, you gotta love Mookie, right? Okay. So why was Mookie Wilson's story so important to tell? Well, Mookie came from the South. He had to deal with terrible bigotry and racism in 1960s South Carolina. He was the son of a sharecropper, one of 12 children. He had to miss school some days because he had to work on the farm. And baseball was his way out. So again, with progress, if it wasn't for Jackie Robinson, 20 years before Mookie was playing high school, and then college ball, the first African-American to play for the University of South Carolina, and then drafted by the Dodgers. This is interesting with the Dodgers and Mets playing. Turned down an offer to be drafted by the Dodgers. Next year, signed with the Mets, and saw terrible days with the Mets, but helped them turn the club around from the depths of the National League to the 1986 World Championship. And then I think the book also humanized Mookie too, because everyone thought that Mookie, they looked at, you know, the 1,000-watt smile, and he was always happy, but he really wasn't. You know, he just kind of went along with things. Lenny Dykstra came up and took a lot of his playing time away, and you know, Mookie, it could have been a very different story if instead of being the team player that he was, going on, becoming free agent, and starting every day for someone else. He would have put in 13, 14 years as a starter. But he so loved playing for the Mets. He was there when they were terrible, there when they became great, and was there at the very, very end of that one-year dynasty that they had. And he famously, of course, made the comment that he feels like a hood ornament now because he wishes that the Mets would look past a lot of the ills from that '86 team and look more at how bright these guys were. The '86 Mets were a tremendous collection of bright baseball men. You know, there was a book, The Bad Guys Won, that came out about 10 years ago, and it really painted the team as being this fraternity, these guys that drank hard and partied hard and were womanizers. But they were also a tremendous collection of baseball talent and baseball intellect. And so that's what the book really focused the most on. Mookie and I had 7 book signings. Over 2,300 people came over those book signings. And you hear the stories. I got to sit next to Mookie for everyone that came up with their book for him to sign. And it was fascinating, the stories about Game 6. Of course, Mookie, he played 13 years, but what's he known for, really? His legacy is that ball he hit up, it was bounced like 20 times up the first baseline, goes through Bill Buckner's legs, and the Mets win Game 6 of the '86 World Series. That's what he's remembered for. That's what's going to be on the poor guy's epitaph. But the stories that we heard, and I have to share my favorite because I think it's just a classic. This woman, I guess she was about 50 years old. She comes up to Mookie with her book, and she goes, "I just want to really thank you for getting that ground ball through Buckner's legs." And so Mookie says, "Well, why? Besides the fact that you're a Mets fan." Well, she goes, "Well, understand, I was in labor that night, and Mookie, you came up to bat, and my husband said, 'There's 2 outs in the 10th inning. Mets are down a run. You just have to wait for Mookie's at bat to be over with.'" So there's the wild pitch to tie the game, and then Mookie hits the ground ball through Buckner's legs, and they win it, and the husband took the wife to the hospital. I just, maybe it was the way that she told the story, but she was legitimately so thankful for Mookie for doing that. So I just finished a book which really relates to progress in sports because, like I said earlier, the book it's coming out in March. It's called The Kings of Queens, and I interviewed what I felt were the 14 key and most riveting figures from that '86 team. And Davey Johnson did the foreword, another fascinating baseball lifer. So, when you talk about progress in sports, the sport of baseball has rid itself pretty much of steroids. I think it's rid itself of their illegal drug problem that they had in the early '80s. So when you look at the '86 Mets, you look at them and it's almost like a time capsule, a different time. And like what Roy White was saying, I mean, back in those days, guys really had fun. Like they went out. So like 20 Mets would go out to dinner if they were on the road. Now it's kind of like 25 players, 25 taxis, 25 entourages, or they go out and they work out in the weight room. It's a very different dynamic. The clubhouses now are like country clubs. They're massive. A lot of times the media can't get to them. So the game has really changed. But back then, and when Roy played, guys really got to know each other. They got to know their families. They got to go out. They were on the road. So the Mets had a lot of fun. But a lot has happened to them since their playing days. And some of the guys I featured in the book, like Ed Hearn, he got traded from the Mets. He was in the Dave Cone trade. And he was Gary Carter's backup catcher. Ed Hearn was on his way to being the starting catcher of the Royals. And Ed Hearn became suicidal, and he got over that. But he's been dealing with tremendous illnesses for the last 30 years. So there's that story. There's Keith Hernandez, who left the Cardinals under suspicions of drug use, gets traded to the Mets and becomes the team captain, and arguably should be in the Hall of Fame as the greatest defensive first baseman of all time and the captain of those great Mets teams in the '80s. Wally Backman, who's trying so hard to get into the major leagues, and it seems like he's in every conversation, but he's been the minor league manager of the year 3 times. He's 6 first-place finishes. So there's that story about getting back to the major leagues. There's Lenny Dykstra. I mean, an incredible fall from grace. A tremendous baseball player. Then he goes into the business world, makes another $70 million, and then loses it all 18 months later. Goes to jail, and now he's trying to make his way back. So there are all these stories, like with Doug Sisk and Bobby Ojeda. So they all... they had this momentous moment together in '86, and it was like a shooting star. So the book really talks about today what has become of them since, how they've tried to overcome their challenges in life, and also look back at that great '86 season. So progress in baseball, yeah, there's been a lot of progress, but there are a few things that I would love to see changed. I would love to see them speed up the games even more than they are now. I would love for the instant replay to go away. You know, I just think it takes up too much time. But again, they've made progress. The wild card is less important than winning a division championship. The All-Star game means something. And I think we have a great new commissioner now that would make A. Bartlett Giamatti very, very proud. So I offer my strongest congratulations to the Pastime Club for all they've meant to this community over the last 100 years, and all they'll undoubtedly mean to the community for the next 100. Thank you.